Okay, we are recording it, so go ahead, Adam.
Thanks, Stu. Good afternoon, everybody. Quick introduction. My name is Adam Wilson, and I'm currently serving as the moderator to the ad hoc committee for the Rainbow Fallbrook proposals for detachment from the County Water Authority. Today is Tuesday, May 10th, and we're here as a working group, as a subset to the ad hoc committee to drill down deeper on some of the rate impacts that have surfaced out of the independent study by Dr. Michael Hanneman and through some communications and dialogues through our ad hoc committee deliberations and previous meetings. So we don't have a actual formal agenda before us, but before we get started, perhaps we can maybe do quick introductions from everybody so that we can familiarize everybody's faces and names and our speakers. And so, Kim, you always like to start us off, so why don't you go?
Sure, absolutely. Kim Thorner, GM at Aleven Water. I'm on the ad hoc committee by way of the Special Districts Advisory Committee, and was nominated by Keene to be on this sub-work group, and also asked Pierce if he could give us a primer today. I thought it was very important to start us off down this road.
Thanks, Kim. Lydia, maybe you're next since you are a part of the working group as well.
Sure. My name is Lydia Romero. I am part of the LAFCO working group, and then I was nominated by Keene to be part of the subcommittee. And I'm representing the sort of city managers section of San Diego County.
Thanks, Lydia and Kimberly. Thanks for both attending today. And I guess I'll make note that the other two working group members that have been welcome to participate their time with us that are not present at the moment are Keith Greer with Sandag and Brian Albright with the County of San Diego. So hopefully either they're both going to be popping in here shortly, and if not, we are recording today so that they can go back and watch our discussion. And maybe we can kick it off to Pierce, because he's maybe kind of the lead speaker here today. So maybe Pierce, if you want to just take a quick moment to make a quick introduction of yourself.
Will do. So Pierce Rossum with the San Diego County Water Authority. I am the revenue and debt manager there. So essentially in charge of bringing in the revenue through rate design and then managing the debt as well. With that, I'll pass it to Lisa Marie. Lisa Marie, you're on mute.
Good afternoon. I'm Lisa Marie Harris, and I'm the finance director and the treasurer for the San Diego County Water Authority.
Thank you. Thanks for being with us. And I think you have one more member from the Water Authority, Tish.
Hi, I'm Tish Berg, and I apologize for my background and any echoing. I'm actually just released from jury duty for the day, so my apologies for any sound problems. I'm Assistant General Manager of the San Diego County Water Authority. In that role, I oversee finance, administration, public affairs, and government relations. Prior to this, I was General Manager of Sweetwater Authority, which is a retail water agency serving 190,000 people down in South Bay. And then prior to that, I was Director of Finance for Rincon del Diablo Municipal Water District, a retail water agency serving parts of Escondido and San Marcos. Thank you.
Thanks, Tish. Thanks for joining us. Good to see a familiar face. I know you and I worked previously in our past experiences with Diane Jacobs' office and Sweetwater Authority. So good to see us both in some new capacities here. Maybe I'll kick it over to Keene Simons, who Executive Officer for San Diego LAFCO. And I know we have some staff members that are helping us administratively here today too. So Keene.
Yeah, thank you, Adam, and good afternoon, everyone. So as Adam mentioned, I'm the director at LAFCO, closing in on year 5 here in San Diego. Joining me today from LAFCO staff, we've got Du our normally GIS wizard, but also since COVID, increasingly our all thing IT person. Thank you, Du. And then Tammy Luckett is the commission clerk, and Tammy is going to be taking just very abbreviated minutes that we will essentially have for the record, although I think we will have future meetings of the working group to formally approve them. And then, Adam, you may dive into this, but just for the context of how we are here and how and the why of Kim reaching out to peers. So in the course of pivoting our work with the ad hoc committee and the completion of this, what we refer to as the Hanneman process that looked at some specific issues, we at LAFCO staff asked, and the ad hoc committee agreed, for a working group to help LAFCO staff, again, through the ad hoc process, but help LAFCO staff understand and ultimately come up with some qualified and or quantified measure to understand what would be the financial impact to specific members should Fallbrook and or Rainbow leave. And so what we are certainly hoping to get a primer from Pierce on is just the formula, the overall formula of how these things kind of get interpreted at the Water Authority side. And then that will help Adam and LAFCO's staff. And I see Keith has joined us. So you're going to have to do an introduction in a second, Keith, but that will help us drill down, as our commission has asked, to understand rate impacts for 3 examples: City of San Diego, Valley Center, and then City of Poway. So that's the kind of the broad strokes of how we've started down this path. And Adam, I'll kick it back to you, and I'm here just to listen, but thank you so much.
Thanks, Keen. I think you teed it up perfectly. And before we get going, maybe just pass the baton quickly to Keith. Keith, as you joined us, we've all just been doing some quick introductions. We've mentioned that you would be popping on and that you were a member of the working group. I don't know if you want to just really briefly tell the group quickly about who you are and what role you play with Sandag.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, my name is Keith Greer. I'm an environmental manager for Sandag. So I've been doing this job for about 15 years and in environmental field about 30. So I just got voluntold to come to this meetings. And so thank you very much.
Thanks, Keith. Thanks for joining us today. So yeah, as Keen eloquently stated, we're here today to kind of have a kickoff starter dialogue conversation with how we've come to this point from the Hanneman process to the deliberations of our ad hoc committee and them wishing to work and study on additional items, and then narrowing that down to specifically what those rate impacts would be to the 3 specific agencies that Keen highlighted, being the City of San Diego, Valley Center, and Poway. And so through our communication, Kim thought it would be a good suggestion to kick off kind of that information and that discovery to have Pierce and the CWA come do a presentation on how they present rate impacts and how they analyze those and how they move and adjust accordingly, and how those inner workings are all involved with this. And so, Kim, I don't know if there's anything more you want to preface before kicking it off to Keen, but I just want to give you one last opportunity to maybe kind of highlight anything more that we're missing here.
Yeah, well, and I guess when I saw the initial chart that we were looking at, and it was a % of acre feet total, I realized that one of the reasons why we picked these 3 agencies from the Water Authority is they are diverse. In Valley Center is a treated water agency that also gets agricultural water. Poway is a medium-sized agency that has its own treatment plant, and then City of San Diego, obviously the biggest agency. And it isn't just an acre foot translation at the Water Authority. However many acre feet, everybody pays the same. There are different buckets that the Water Authority puts their rates into. And I know enough to be dangerous. So that's why I asked for Pierce to come to kind of explain the basics, so that when we do look at what the ratepayer impacts at these 3 agencies, I don't think we're going to get exact. but close enough that everybody on this committee feels comfortable that we went through the process, understood how the water authority puts rates in buckets to move forward. So I thank you guys for allowing this. And I also super appreciative of the water authority staff, because I know they're in the middle of budgets and rates right now. So thank you.
And I'd like to echo that, Kim. I know putting this meeting together was fairly quickly and a lot of maneuvering with multiple calendars. So I appreciate everybody making themselves so available so quickly. So without further ado, Pierce, if you're ready, if you could jump into the wonderful world of water and let us know how you calculate all your rates. And if you could break it down in 30 seconds and let us know, we'd be happy. So
I'll try my best. 30 seconds is a tall order.
All kidding aside, now go ahead and have the floor and please walk us through what you feel is best to help us better understand this world.
Yeah, absolutely. And feel free to interrupt and ask questions as we proceed. I do have just kind of a quick presentation, as was the request, really just to focus on kind of what is cost of service, how are rates generated, and how do we do it at the Water Authority? And then kind of wrapping up with an evolution of the rate design, because rates really have to reflect the cost of service. So as service changes, the rates have to adapt in tandem. So, Kim likes to pick on me, so I'm gonna put something up here that's familiar to Kim is her rate schedule for the Leavenhain Water District. And water rates really are more than just a bill. There's an entire industry here that I come from. Prior to joining the Water Authority 3-4 years ago, I was a consultant to the Water Authority developing rates and charges for them. I was the outside third-party review. So I've developed rates for countless agencies up and down the state and throughout the country, really trying to find that question. How much should you pay for water and why? So when we take a look at, your water bill, it's going to look different for every agency. We have 24 member agencies right now, and all of them, while being members of the Water Authority, bill differently. Some have uniform rates, some have tiered rates. They have different customer classes, lots of different things. Some have high fixed charges, some have low fixed charges. And really the way it's done is there's a whole industry, like I said, but as part of the process for retail agencies, they need to develop a cost of service report and do a Prop 218 notice. And that's kind of what's shown on the right hand of the screen here is that water rate study. So this for Leavenhain was last done in 2018 or 2019, and it sets rates. And for retail agencies, you generally set rates every 3 to 5 years. So you kind of take a point in time, you forecast out your costs, you forecast out your demands, and you try to set rates. And that's what's kind of noticed in the schedule there. When you do this, the agencies really look to kind of industry standards and guidelines. As I mentioned, Proposition 218 is kind of the measuring stick or the bar we have to achieve here in California. It says that the rates have to be fair and reasonable and a nexus to the service that's being provided. AWWA, so the American Water Works Association, is the largest kind of aggregator of this information of water professionals. They have an entire manual that's in its 7th edition right now that looks nationally to develop principles of water rates, charges, and fees. Down there in the caveat, they make this a number of times, but so while there are standards to cost of service, they say that it's important to understand that cost of service is not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's not a prescribed single approach. So when you set rates, you generally have kind of a simple methodology. This is the framework that all agencies really, whether it's retail or wholesale, try to fit within. The first step is the revenue requirements analysis. This is the thing that really defines how much revenue you need to generate. So you take a look at what are your costs, how much water are you purchasing, how much staff do you have, chemicals, all of those things, the day in, day out costs, capital, debt service, all of those get into a general bucket, and you say, how much do I need to generate from rates? You generally look to offset some of those rates if you have any outside revenue. So do you have property tax revenue? Do you have land leases or cell tower leases, those types of revenues that can mitigate how much you need to recover from your ratepayers? The next thing, and Kim mentioned this in terms of buckets, you take your costs and you try to define how those costs relate to the service that's being provided, right? How do we take those costs and how do we allocate them in a fair and equitable manner? If you look in the dictionary, there's no definition of, perfectly defined definition of fair and reasonable. There's perception of fairness. And so, that's one of the things we'll take a look at. But, when you're setting rates and you're doing those types of things, what's reasonable. Does it pass the smell test? Does it not? And so that's what we try to achieve. And then you go into rate design. So you've got your total costs that you need to allocate. You've dispersed them into different buckets based on service. And then you need to decide, well, how do I recover that cost? What is a rate design element that can collect that revenue in an equitable manner, right? Do I just say, hey, I have got $1 million that I need to recover. I've got 24 member agencies. I'm just going to divvy it up equally 24 ways. That's one way to do it, but does that relate to the service that's being provided? And so that's what we'll take a look at. And there's lots of objectives that you try to do. How effective is that rate design in achieving the total revenue requirements? Can it achieve full cost recovery? Is it stable? Is it predictable? This was something that was highlighted in the Hanneman report in terms of fixed costs versus fixed revenues. Is there kind of an alignment there? And there's a lot of discussion within the industry of how do you balance affordability? How do you balance infrastructure heavy costs and debt laden utilities with volumetric? We're the only industry out there that's trying to sell less. We're constantly calling for conservation. We're constantly saying use less water, but that of course impacts our ability to recover revenue, especially if a lot of our revenue is on a volumetric or pay as you use basis. We also want rates, as you go down the list, you want rates that are simple and easy to understand. Can you give this quick elevator speech in 30 seconds, right? Can you make it so someone quickly looks at their bill and understands, okay, I can generally understand how my bill works, or do you need to pull out a calculator, right? And then the final step here is it legal and defensible? There are many ways to allocate costs, but basically there are costs when you take a look at it that benefit all customers. We've got our board of directors, we've got customer service, we've got billing. All of those types of costs are benefiting specific customers or all customers. Then you may have costs that only benefit specific customers. And so can you directly allocate those dollars to those customers? When you take a look at your customers, so for the water authority, we've got 24 member agencies, but for retail agencies, they've got single family, they've got commercial, industrial, agriculture, government. They'll have different types of classes. And really it's to look at how those different users use the system differently. And is there a different level of service attributed to that customer class or that type of use. One challenge is we in finance have, a good ability to track costs, but we can't track costs down to the, drop of water. We can't drill down to the individual customer. Certainly from a retail perspective, you can't drill down to every single individual. There have to be some costs where you aggregate, you make assumptions to say, how are we going to spread this cost? And so, accepted measures of reasonable rates is whether they go back to those cost of service principles that are defined in the M1 manual. When you take a look at costs, there are different ways to use this system. And one example I give is throughout the year, you can have 2 customers that are using 12 units of water, right? 1 unit a month. If one customer uses 1 a month, they're kind of just doing a base load demand. But if another customer uses 0 in every month but 1 and uses 12, are they using the system the same? Should they, at the end of the year, pay the same amount of water, or should they have, over the course of a year, different costs? And so you take a look at that system and you say, is the system there for base demand? Is it there for peak? I have to build my system in order to meet, between those 2 customers, 13 units of water. But if they just use water the same, it would be, I could design a system around 2 units of water. And then how do you balance that with changes in use, changes in patterns, right? Kind of the question that's coming up in this conversation is what happens if you build a system and then have customers leave? You can't go back in time and try to recollect those costs from those customers. And so you have to set rates proportional to the use. When we take a look more, we've got a couple different concepts of equity and fairness. When we take a look at this, we see, you'll see words of horizontal equity, vertical equity, and intergenerational equity. And a lot of the time, this kind of just depends on what your time scale is. Are you trying to have costs that are perfectly equitable day in, day out? Are you trying to have something that is fair today, fair next week, and fair in a couple of years? And, kind of given that 2 customer example with, 12 units versus 1 unit, right? They're both using 12 units throughout the year, but are they similar? Are they the same? And so you kind of have to look at different definitions of equity. So all of those concepts get rolled into rate design, how the rate is ultimately adopted. And, there's a lot of science and math in terms of the first 2 steps, the revenue requirements and the functional allocation. When you get to the rate design, you've got some different definitions and different stakes here at play when people are talking what's easy to understand, what's easy to administer, what provides revenue stability. And so those at the end of the day become a judgment call. Those go to your policymakers, the boards, the councils, trying to decide what rates work for those agencies. So that's a quick little primer on kind of rate setting in general. And now I want to just quickly go through the water authority's cost of service, as that's kind of the real nut here. So looking at the water authority, we kind of, as we step through that whole process, we have a financial goal, a rate framework, and a cost of service review. The financial goal is really how can we achieve the longest or the lowest cost of capital over the long run. We want to be able to maintain a strong credit rating, and that means having strong reserves, having fixed revenues, having a stable base to achieve that low cost of capital. We have $1 billion of debt on the books. And so right now, if we don't maintain that, that's a higher cost of maintaining and paying for that system in the long run. We want to have a rate framework that ultimately minimizes ratepayer impacts while maintaining fiscal responsibility. There's a lot of talk about affordability and those types of things, but when we take a look at, say, your car, at a certain point, you're going to need to replace the tires, right? And the question is, do you do that right when, the tire manufacturer says you don't have enough tread, or do you keep driving on it? And as you drive more on it, the risk factor goes up. So we want to be able to, have a lowest cost of capital, but also not push the system too far that we risk the health and safety of the region. And then the cost of service review. As I mentioned, in my prior life, I was a third-party consultant for the Water Authority. We have third-party reviews come in from time to time, looking at rates and charges. This is what our typical rate setting schedule looks like. We develop rates each and every year. So as I said, retail agencies generally look to set rates for 3 to 5 years. The Water Authority, since we develop the rates in-house and have a third-party review come in, we develop it annually along with our budget, and just trying to really maximize or mitigate the number of assumptions we have to make in the model. We try to be as precise as we can year in, year out to make those rates as low as possible. So generally it's a 6-month process. It starts in January, get going through all the data collection, the assumptions, the model building. We start presenting some of those inputs and assumptions in March, present rates in April, and then kind of refine in May for final adoption in June. Once the rates are adopted in June, the retail agencies have about 6 months to get their financial house in order because these rates are adopted on a calendar year basis. So a June adoption is for the next, well, those rates would take effect the following January. So right now we're looking to set calendar 2023 rates, and we'll be going to the board later this month with a recommendation. I showed you kind of the typical rate setting process. So this is the process that the Water Authority does year in, year out. The one change here is when we get to that 4th step, we basically have the rates and the charges, and then depending on how each agency uses their use of the system, we allocate our fixed charges. I'll get into that in a second. We allocate those fixed charges to the member agencies based on their use of the system or other key metrics. We have that regular third-party review, and this year, following some input from the board late last year, we're actually having an additional third-party review just to green light the rates and just make sure everything is as tight as they possibly can be. When we set the revenue requirements, we look to establish total required revenue to meet the service. We want the revenues to be sufficient to ensure proper operation and maintenance of the system. We need to sustain the system and preserve financial integrity. So the components of that, as I've mentioned, is O&M costs, debt service, policy, and coverage needs. So this is one thing where you need to replace a water heater in a house. What you can do is you can build up a reserve. You can say, hey, I need to tuck away an extra $100 a month. By the time my water heater's in need of replacement, I have enough in reserves. So that's something we can build into our rates, capital expenditures, and non-rate revenues. Functional allocations, these are the buckets. We really want to make sure how those costs are defined from a service standpoint, and then what buckets they go into. What we've tried to do is really align our costs with our services, with our rates. And so when we take a look at all those different costs that we incur, we break them down into 5 simple categories. Is it a customer service related charge? Is it a supply cost? Is it storage, transportation, or treatment related? Once we have that done, we can go into rate design. And what the board's done is, again, this is kind of a policy-driven approach in terms of rate design. The board has outlined criteria to evaluate rate structures. And we're actually going through a rate design process right now. The board's moved that over to the member agency managers. So we're working with each of the member agency managers on potentially changing or tweaking the rate structure for calendar 24. But these are kind of the board outlined objectives, really for cost recovery, revenue stability, consistent with cost of service principles, affordability, feasibility, and compatibility with MWD and diversifying revenue sources. When we take a look at the actual rates and charges, these are all board approved. And so we've got the resolutions, the ordinances up there at the top. But when we take a look at the functional allocation and ultimately the rate design, we have clear definitions of what the cost is and where it should be allocated. And so each of our cost of service reports outlines kind of these definitions of what the cost is, what the bucket is defined, and why those costs are allocated there. And that's a really important thing to define and define clearly, because as you get new costs, as costs change or shift, there is no uncertainty on where that cost should be collected from. And so this is a real strength of the Water Authority's rate schedule. So we've got, again, supply, treatment, transportation, customer service, storage, and then 2 additional charges that were developed as part of kind of working with different stakeholders throughout time. We got the supply reliability charge that was a board adopted charge, essentially to recover costs associated with the funding of our reliability. We have the Carlsbad desal plant, and we have our QSA supplies. And so we take that cost of reliability and spread it out on a 5-year basis, rather than trying to incur that cost volumetrically, whether you actually use that water that year or the next year. We also have an infrastructure access charge. That's our true one fixed revenue that's based on a meter equivalent basis. So these are the rates and charges. They're broken up into 2 different categories here. We've got the variable rates, or the volumetric rates. So this is all the revenue that is subject to changes and whims of demand. So as individuals or ratepayers use or don't use water, we either collect that cost or we don't. And right now, about 73%, 74% of our revenue is volumetric. So if demand dropped to 0 tomorrow, we would lose 73% of our revenue. That's not going to happen, but we are subject to volatility there. If individuals detach, all that revenue does go away. Fixed annual charges, these are fixed from an annual perspective. We define that we're going to, for customer service, for example, generate 25.6 million, and we will collect that over the course of the year. But as each agency changes demand, because it's a 3-year rolling average, as your average use changes, your allocation of that 25.6 million will change. And so this is really going to be where some of those impacts to those 3 agencies you're looking at, that will be seen here, because their allocation of those 3 fixed charges is going to go up if 6 or 7% of the volume is removed. And then other charges, infrastructure access charge, we've got $4.24 per meter equivalent. And so this is, each account or each retail customer has an account, and there's a meter attached to that account, and that's kind of a proxy for your ability to use the system. So at the end of the day, if you're connected to the system, whether you use a drop today, there's always the potential capacity for you to take water from our system. And so that's why we try to collect that. And my final slide here is just kind of the evolution of rate design. As I mentioned, these are our existing rates and charges, but when you step back kind of to the 90s, there's been a lot of change in the industry, and there's been a lot of change at the Water Authority. And so we try to constantly look at our rate schedule, our rates and charges, and say, are we providing the same service, or do we need to change our rates to reflect the new level of service? And when you look at the 90s, the Water Authority added new charges really to support the CIP program. That was the standby charge and capacity fees, one-time connection fees. As you join the system, you pay for part of that system. In 1998, we implemented additional charges to support our emergency storage program, or ESP, and that big CIP program. And so we developed the infrastructure access charge. And then at that time, we also adopted a special ag water rate to reflect a potentially lower level of service. If you don't need storage, then you can go to a lower level of reliability and pay a cheaper rate there. In 2003, we unbundled our rates. So rather than just paying a rate for everything, we kind of broke it apart. And so you could pay a supply rate, a treatment rate, a customer service charge, right? We broke it up into those individual categories. Sometimes the policies changed based on financial requirements. So we looked at, in 2006, that green box, the rate stabilization fund, and our debt coverage ratio. As we said, we have about $1 billion of debt outstanding. And so a debt coverage ratio, for every dollar of debt we have to collect $1.50 to meet that ratio, and that preserves our credit worthiness. The higher that ratio, the higher our credit score, essentially. And then, we continue to change with supply reliability and the PSAR rate that was adopted in 21. So it's the same as the special ag rate, but it was just made permanent rather than a transitional or a temporary program. So I haven't seen any questions come up so far, but I'm happy to address it now with my conclusion.
Pierce, thanks so much. That was a very well put and thorough presentation that was presented in a very simplistic point of view and very overarching and global, and helped me understand. In fact, I wrote down a handful of questions and didn't want to stop you in the middle of your presentation. So maybe I can just kick off some questions just from a level of education and curiosity. And then we can kind of open the floor to anybody else and have a discussion here. But out of curiosity, you kicked off your presentation with the AWWA, I think was the acronym.
Yes.
As the, are those guidelines for industry standards, or does an individual agency go seek kind of their gold stamp of approval? And I would use the analogy of, like, if you're trying to go get a green building, you go get LEEDs certification. How does that work?
Yeah, so there's no certification program for cost of service in that standpoint. So you can't be, M1 approved. They do make the caveat, as we showed up on the screen there, that you have to take all the individual ratios and characteristics of your own agency into consideration. California, I guess no surprise, is kind of on the higher edge of meeting of cost of service requirements. So M1 being a national standard doesn't quite live up to the benchmark or that gold standard of California cost of service, but it's kind of the framework, the general industry standard, just to know that you're on the right track.
Gotcha. Thank you. Second question, you then got into how you calculate revenues. And you mentioned that in some cases there's diversity amongst agencies on how they acquire those revenues, whether they're off of fixed costs from water rates, or if some agencies are maybe diversifying a bit more through alternative methods as property taxes and or cell towers. And I'm sure there's many more out there that are generating revenue. Is there an industry standard to that ratio? I would imagine there's some agencies that are just strictly off the rates, the water rates. And I imagine there's agencies out there that are maybe a little bit more well-managed and looking to diversify and increase their revenues. And do you have some sort of percentage of range between who's solely off of water rates and who diversifies even more?
No, again, there's no standard there. It's really just, especially in California, whether, before Prop 13, whether you had a percentage of the property tax basis. Some agencies were lucky enough to have that, other agencies not. So it's not necessarily in terms of management. Same thing with cell phone tower leases. That's one opportunity. Really, for California, in terms of Prop 218, the rule is that you can't have one ratepayer subsidize another. And so you have to look, if you're going to try to offset costs or have a low income rate or those types of things, you have to use outside revenues. And so some agencies look to that. But those do change from time to time, whether you have additional land that you no longer need. So you can do, you can sell that land, you can do cell tower leases. Some agencies are looking to those opportunities, but they don't always present themselves.
Gotcha. Next question is, then you discussed how you calculate rates, and the challenge amongst that is you use the example of one customer using 1 unit per month and one customer using 12 units for 1 month. Is there a minimum, does this work like electricity? Does the infrastructure require like a minimal flow to keep that infrastructure operating? And is there like a peak capacity that would overwhelm the system? And does that move into any sort of calculation to those rates based on if I were a layman and trying to compare it to the electricity world?
Yeah, no, there's some similarities there. I think you see that right now with SDG&E. There's the challenges with solar, right? And kind of just when that power comes online and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. The challenge with water is we are an infrastructure driven agency, right? Or industry really. And so at that point in time, you'll develop things that take a long time to build, design, and fund. And then you'll, use it for 30, 50, 60, 100 years. And how do you make those decisions when you want to provide reliability, but at the same time, you have an uncertain volume going forward. And so I think that is the challenge. I think that is the big question of just when you have certainty and when you have a long time horizon, you can plan for things. When things spring up on you and are done overnight, that's something that the industry is not really good at handling.
Gotcha. Two more quick questions related to process here. The next one, you highlighted a Levenhein's rate study impact in 2019. How does that work independently to CW's rate structure analysis, or does it work in collaboration? And how does that process work with each member agency doing their own rate study? And then also at the end game, what if there is discrepancies between their independent study and your final calculations to rates, and how is that resolved?
Yeah, so there is our rate and charge process where we define the allocation to each of the member agencies. So that is done, in-house and then done through our third-party reviews. Once we determine what those rates are and those allocations will be, each individual rating or each individual retail agency will then take those rates and then decide, go through that whole process. Just look at the revenue requirements, look at the functional allocation, and figure out how they want to recover it. So not all agencies treat our costs in the same way. They don't all recover it in the same way. Some of them have pass-through mechanisms where as our rates go up, there's just an automatic pass-through of our costs to their rates. Some bake it in to their rates. And so it's really just an individual decision by each retail agency.
Gotcha. Okay, real quickly, last question. You mentioned the revenue generated for CWA was 73% volumetric and 18% fixed. Historically, is that gap shrinking as water usage is decreasing, and is there efforts to work towards more of a fixed cost, as that was somewhat one of Hammond's takeaway on the financial model, somewhat quote unquote being kind of broken in the region?
Yes. So, we've shared kind of looking back at our history, we've gone from about mid-single digits fixed cost recovery to where we are today in about mid-20s. But if we maintain the existing rate structure, and this is a question to the member agency managers as we look to potentially refine our rate structure going forward, what should that number be? If we maintain the status quo, we just developed a long-range financial plan last year that looked out 10 years. If you keep the existing rate structure, our fixed revenues actually drop from about 26% to low 20%, 21%. And so the volumetric rate is going to go up. The fixed costs are about the same. And so that's a question. We're having this conversation with that work group right now in terms of what is the true revenue risk. I don't know if it's not necessarily broken. As I said, we're not going to lose 70% of our revenue overnight. Demand's not going to go down to zero, but it is kind of just this constant challenge. And, as I mentioned, it's really just a time game. The longer you have to plan for things, the longer you can adapt. We can make those changes incrementally, gradually. It's just big changes that, disrupt that formula, disrupt that equation is the real challenge to rates and charges.
Got it. And broken may have been the wrong adjective, but at least a spotlight being put on the projections and how the region moves forward towards the different rate structures as we project out. So those are my questions. I think, thank you, just from an educational and curiosity standpoint. And so I don't know if Kim or Lydia as members and Keith as member of the working group, I don't know if you had any additional questions that you'd like to ask Pierce. Kimberly, I think you raised your hand.
Yep, thank you. Pierce, I just want to refresh my memory. Agricultural water, TSAR, they don't pay the storage fee. Is that correct? There's a certain fee that agricultural agencies do not pay. And is that storage?
Yeah, so that's storage and supply reliability. Those two fixed charges, the allocations that are derived exclude water usage for PSAR customers.
Okay. And so I would think, and I guess this is more of a statement, that 3,000 acre feet of water purchased by Rainbow is not the same dollar revenue from 3,000 acre feet of water purchased from Poway, right? Because Poway doesn't have the same percentage of TSAR, so they would be paying the supply reliability, they would be paying the customer service, but then there's an offset there because Rainbow is 100% treated water and Poway is 100% raw, right? And so I'm trying to wrap my brain around, I don't think it's an acre foot to acre foot translation. Maybe it's more of a percentage of dollars paid to CWA over like the past, like a 3-year average, and it's a percent of dollars. And you would assume then going forward, those percents stay somewhat consistent. Somebody doesn't just randomly build a treatment plant or switch off of ag. And that maybe the dollars contributed are a better formula for spreading any revenue loss. And that's a question. I'm trying to wrap my brains around how do you take an ag agency versus a non-one and one that has its own treatment plant or not?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and I agree with you. Just purely doing it on a volumetric basis is limiting, right? And so I think if you're trying to get at something more precise, certainly looking at their historical contribution is a good way of doing it, and that information's kind of readily available because that's what our voting entitlement's based on. So you can kind of look at what those agencies have done historically in terms of contribution. And so that's kind of rate and charge agnostic. It's simply, what was the service provided and the cost collected.
And that is what you publish when you update the voting entitlement every year at the Water Authority. You do it, I think, in December. Is it December of each year? And does that go back in year increments? Is it 3, 10? I can't remember. It's
lifetime. So
lifetime.
It is.
Okay.
Yeah. And so what we do is we add the incremental addition for that, preceding year. And then that will be done on a fiscal year basis. So you're right. We come back in December once the fiscal year closes, and then we do the new calculation for that voting entitlement the following calendar year.
Okay. Thank you. That's the only questions I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Kim. Maybe Lydia, I could check in with you as a working group member. And I know you noted that you have some additional commitments on your calendar too. So maybe check in with you real quick.
I do. I don't have any additional questions right now. I need to probably sit in it a little bit. I was just hoping that perhaps, Adam, you might be able to send Pierce's PowerPoint to take a look at. My agency does sanitation rates, and we do something very similar when we're setting the rate. So this is not all foreign to me, but I want to kind of sit in how that works and then goes to the retail scale. Because I think we reverse it with metro charges and our wastewater charges. So great presentation. Thank you. You distilled it really, really well. Something that I thought would be a very complicated topic to something that was digestible for a novice. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Lydia. Yeah, and Pierce, hopefully maybe we can communicate and have your presentation be sent to us so that we can distribute it to the group. So yeah, we're already running up here on an hour, and it's a lot to digest in an hour. And so hopefully maybe give some people some ample time to kind of go through it again. And then also, Lydia, too, we're recording this meeting as well. So give people the opportunity to go back and rewatch it. And any other members of the public or interested parties can come in and view it as well. So thank you. Keith?
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions, one clarification, and a couple of questions. Pierce, thank you very much. The presentation was very helpful, and I'll reiterate what Lydia said, which is it wasn't dry. We could follow it, we can understand it. So thank you. It's kind of like when I sat on an HOA board. It seems like a very complicated HOA consideration where you have revenues that you kind of offset some of the costs for your HOA. You have some fixed costs, like every once in a while we had to have a new tennis court repaved or a pool repaved, and you have to figure out how you're going to pay that back. And then I was thinking about that under that model, which is like, what happens if 7% of the homeowners decide they want to succeed from the HOA? And what does that mean to the rest of the HOA homeowners? So that's my layman's perspective of how I'm looking at this. I want to clarify something. At the beginning of the presentation, you said we did something to look at the rates every 3 to 5 years, but the rate settings are done every year. Did I miss that? What was the 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, no, sorry if there was confusion. So retail agencies generally set rates every 3 to 5 years. So that would be kind of like the Livenheim rate study. The water authority sets rates each and every year.
Okay, so annual rates done every year, and then some kind of contract or agreement comes in with each water district that they're going to be adhered to those rates. Is that correct? How does
There's
it pass along to your member agencies?
Yeah, so they're member agencies. They're part of the water authority, so they're in that sphere. And so when we allocate those costs, they're going to pay the fixed charges. And so the only thing that's certain would be our fixed charges and our infrastructure access charge, and then volumetric charges are basically pay as you go.
So the fixed charges themselves, when these fixed charges are decided, like for example, the new emergency storage or a desal plant, and they wanted to fix that cost in the model, is that presented to all the jurisdictions on your member agencies? And do they know it's going to have a certain return in terms of having to pay out that on a certain time frame?
Yes. So each time those rates got developed, each time we added something or modified something to the rate design, there is a long and lengthy discussion, generally held within the member agencies, their general managers, their finance directors, and at the board level. The last time we added a rate component was in 2015. That was the supply reliability charge. That took over 2 years to develop. And really that wasn't a question of, it's moving the, kind of the air in the balloon a little bit. And so it wasn't a question about cost. It was just, do we collect some of this cost 100% volumetrically, or should we have some fixed costs associated with that? And there was a debate whether it should be a 3-year rolling average, a 5-year rolling average, or a 10-year rolling average. And they kind of split the baby and finally come up with 5 years. So always a lot of discussion in terms of how those costs are allocated, and everyone gets their input.
But it's not a shock to them. For example, I understand the volumetric charges, which is basically I'm consuming something, I'm paying for that. The fixed costs go longer. It's kind of like I'm part of the system. I pay for those fixed costs on an annual basis for a certain period of time. My question for you is, though, those fixed costs, are they known for a period of time by the member agencies?
I can jump in real quick. So Pierce mentioned the long range financing plan, and in that plan, we provide the member agencies, the public, the rating agencies, everybody, a high-low guidance for rates over a 10-year period. So that way the member agencies have a sense of what the highest rate will be and the lowest rate will be for the fixed and the volumetric rates.
Thank you. Going back to that HOA model, I'm still thinking about, is it known on next year how much of the cost for fixed rates are there versus how much for volumetric? And it seems like with that long range plan, they have an idea. There's at least an idea going forward. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks, Keith. Good questions. I think that was kind of dovetailing off kind of my curiosity too, between the volumetric and the fixed, and how those projections and percentages change going into the future, and how those are calculated and how those are made present to each member agency. So yeah, a lot more to digest on that. Keen, I don't know if you've been sitting there on your hands, pins and needle. I don't know if you're chomping at the bit or if you just still want to observe, but do you have any questions to continue?
I think, Pierce, I echo what everyone else said. A very good presentation. I think I will follow Lydia's lead. I have questions, but I want to think about how to ask them. There are some thoughts. I have some questions about the debt, and then, I'll leave it at that. I have some questions, but I want to think a little more thoroughly how to ask the questions. So thank you, though, for the presentation.
Thanks, Keen. Anybody else on the call that would like to ask any questions or make any comments? I don't see anybody jumping. So Pierce, you or anybody of your team, do you want to say anything in conclusion?
Just thank you for the opportunity, and then we're happy to address any questions as they come up, or if you have, and we'll send the presentation here shortly to you.
Perfect. Thank you. And again, thank you for your coming and making yourself available and being a part of this process to help us kind of drill down deeper and get a better understanding. So,
And Adam, well, just on that part, in terms of how to facilitate some questions, so maybe to manage Pierce and Lisa and Tish's expectations, should we kind of go through you, like the working group send maybe some questions, there may be some overlap, and then you'll just be maybe the point of contact with Pierce, and that way Pierce isn't having to, get emails from 4 of us at random times?
yeah, I think that would be appropriate strategy is letting me be the point and working with the working group members. And first kicking off, we'll get first working with Pierce to get us the presentation, get that distributed, let people digest it a little bit more, and then through that I can reach out to the working group members to kind of maybe consolidate a response with questions or comments to kind of revert back to Pierce so that they can appropriate reply, and then we can internally strategize how we maybe convene our next meeting that can maybe drill down a bit deeper on some of the stuff that was kind of overarching and global today to kind of get a firm understanding of the actual specific rate structures amongst those 3 agencies to kind of get more clarification on that, if that makes sense to you.
Outstanding.
All right. Well, with all that said, again, thank you for everybody's participation. Thanks to the Water Authority and their team for making their presentation. And without further ado, this meeting is adjourned. And everybody have a great afternoon. Thanks so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.